Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today I have the picture of Dorian Gray. Now, first off, I always thought that this book was called The Portrait, but it's actually The Picture. And a portrait kind of rolls off the tongue more, sounds fancier, but it's apparently The Picture. So this is apparently the only novel by Oscar Wilde. He did a bunch of short stories and poems and other things like that. And this is one of the few or only novels he wrote, which is funny because it does feel like a very extended, long, in its sense of short story. And it's a really interesting book about the deconstruction, I think, of sin. And so I think maybe some backstory that's important is that Oscar Wilde himself was a homosexual, an Irishman, and in that time, in the late 1800s, that was considered highly illegal. And you think of even people like Alan Turing, who were chemically castrated up until the 1940s, 50s. So he had this very taboo habit about him, but he was a tremendous writer, and I really enjoy these kinds of books where it kind of flows in between the factual description of the characters' feelings and conversations, and then this kind of prose, which is explaining how they're feeling, what their mood is, and the whole sort of thought process of their mind. And so there's some really beautiful passages in this book. But it's kind of a good context to keep in mind that he had this desire that couldn't be spoken of, and so it very much deals with feelings of guilt, shame, sin, and in fact, apparently this book was brought as evidence against him for his homosexuality because of the three main characters of the book being Basil Hallward, Henry Wotton, and of course Sir Dorian Gray. I just made up the Sir part. I realized that's not in there at all, but the titular character. And so the kind of little not love triangle, but the little triangle that they have between each character is that Dorian Gray is this young, good-looking, open-minded young man. Basil is a aspiring artist who is secretly deeply enamored with this young man, and he paints this beautiful picture of him. It's a portrait, it's a full, I always imagined it as sort of a profile or a bust kind of image, but I did watch the movie last night, the 47 version, in which it's a full body version. But I always pictured it as just a face kind of thing, because it always talks about his face in the picture. And if I know of Henry Wotton, who is this sly, lurid, sort of retired, isolated, pleasure-seeking, hedonistic gentleman who essentially becomes a negative influence on Dorian. And even at the beginning of the book, where Dorian and Basil are kind of in the studio, and he's painting his portrait. He kind of even warns Henry to stay away from Dorian, but he doesn't. He influences him, and so you kind of see this slow descent of Dorian's character throughout the novel, because it's about how he is corrupted by himself and also Henry. And so essentially what happens is, the whole gist of the book is that Dorian makes a wish that he would stay youthful forever, like the painting, and in exchange he would trade it for his soul or something. And so, of course, over the length of the book, every time Dorian commits a sin or something bad happens, because of him or to his character, the picture or the portrait changes. and it becomes old and weathered and also mean-looking and cruel and nasty, while Dorian himself stays perfectly handsome and youthful. And so, and Henry is the one who first plants this idea. He says something along the lines of, Dorian, you shall not be young forever. You should use it all up while you can, and, because life is nothing but decay and corruption and, all this kind of materialistic kind of talk. And so I think it's a great metaphor for the how sin might affect, or how the weights of what you have done wrong affect you. And so the way it begins with Dorian is that he is madly in love, or falls madly in love with this actress named Sybil Vane, and she's very kind of young and very innocent and like naive, almost like he is. And so they both fall madly in love. And I can't remember exactly what was the moment that caused him to make a decision or change his mind or something, but they go to the theater one night, and Sybil is doing her typical act, but this time she's playing Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, and she puts on a completely lackluster performance. And she does this by her own reasoning, because she can't be bothered to fake loving another person, because she's so in love with Dorian that to act on stage in front of him feels indecent to her. And so she puts on intentionally the worst performance of her life until everyone, half the audience leaves by the second act, and they say it was, terrible, awful. And Dorian himself, he brings his two friends to the play for them to see, this woman he's in love with, and she puts on the worst performance of her life, and he's almost furious with her. And so he goes backstage to meet her, and she says, "Oh, I did this, for you. I can't love anyone else but you." And Dorian has this moment where he might realize that the person he was in love with was the person on the stage and not really who she was, even though she did it for her total love of him. But she wanted her to be this, shining star. And so he goes on this complete rant where he's like, you've killed the love I had for you. You've completely dashed it against the rocks and completely, sent it away. And he says additionally, like, I never want to see you again, never want to think about you again, never want to talk to you again. And so he just completely and utterly disowns her on the spot in a fit of, I guess, rage or selfishness or whatever, of disillusionment. And so he goes home and he, kind of thinks about, what he said and, mulls it over and realizes, I was actually really too harsh. I should try to be good. And so he ends up writing an apology letter to her. And the next day he's about to go out and deliver it in the morning. And Henry comes and tells him, apparently that Sybil Vane committed suicide last night. So it's like the beginning of this curse begins, and Dorian himself is shocked and struck and says, well, oh my God, there's no more point in the world. Like, what have I done? Her blood is on my hands and everything. And Henry says, it's just one aspect of life. Don't let it bother you. It's just one moment out of many. You'll fall in love again, and you'll, fall, whatever. And so he's giving this kind of toxically positive advice, where he's saying, don't worry about the fact that your bride-to-be that you now had your first fight with and you want to reconcile with is dead. You'll find another wife soon enough. And because the only thing that matters is your youth and yourself. And you have this, what I would call the birthing of a black light within Dorian, where he begins essentially serving his shadow or serving himself in a completely selfish way, where it becomes all about his youth, his beauty, his standing, all about himself, and the idea of something outside of himself that's beautiful or divine essentially dies in that moment. And they do a funny thing in the movie where in the book, Henry leaves a book there by intention, it seems, and Dorian, picks up this book, and he begins reading it, and it infects him. It basically becomes this piece of media that we were given no context of. It said something like it's a yellow bound book or something, yellow binding, and in it it's a bunch of poetry about a Parisian who I forget exactly what the context was, but a Parisian who is like seeking for pleasure and living only for pleasure, and all of his meaning in life is given from pleasure and not love or any higher ideal. And so Dorian becomes essentially influenced and infected entirely by this book, and that begins his descent into frivolous living and selfish living and loveless living, really. And what's more interesting is that Henry becomes a part of him in social life, and so when they go to clubs and dinners and whatever, he's always seen with Henry. And so Dorian's reputation over the years, you kind of have this time jump of 20 years, but his reputation over the years becomes this seemingly, like, he seems to be a good person, but he almost seems too good to be true. He seems to be a character in which it seems too pure. And there's rumors that speculate around him that he's just a bad luck person, that ever since, his wife committed suicide, there are all these rumors going about, like, oh, well, he was over here when so-and-so died, and well, he was, in London when, this awful thing happened. And so he becomes this kind of black cat that everyone thinks he's hiding something beneath that, innocent looking face. And so, I forgot to bring up the point, which is that in the movie, they do a different thing entirely, where there's this like cat statue from Egypt that he makes the wish in front of, and the cat Egyptian pagan themed statue thing is the cause for the magical occurrence of his bad luck, and also the painting retaining the form of his true self. And it's kind of hokey, but it's like, okay, all right, whatever. But I like it better in the book because it gives this mystical quality to it, that Basil somehow some magical power with how he paints pictures, that he transferred his desire into the painting. And so this is where it connects now to the author himself, where when he finally paints the Dorian's painting, he says he wants to exhibit it, and Dorian says, no, I'm sorry. Dorian says, why don't you exhibit it? It's a great painting of myself. And then Basil, the artist, says, no, absolutely not, because he says, I've put too much of myself into it. And so I think to translate, to read between the lines in the artist's or author's way, it's that he's put so much adoration into this piece about this man that he loves, that he's worried that people will begin to see that through his own art, which is one way to interpret it. But another way to see it is also, that the sin that he felt for this person, that is a sinful thing, presents itself in this art, and it's living in it. And whenever he looks at it, he doesn't see, a very well done portrait of, great skill and talent, but he sees his unrelentant or unrepentant passions manifest in this painting. And to display that, he's displaying his sin to the world, his desire to the world. And even in the book too, it doesn't say it directly, but it does allude to the fact that Basil himself is deeply enamored with Dorian. And it's funny because when he kind of confesses this in a kind of a sort of pseudo madness, Dorian almost doesn't care, because he's more enamored with his own portrait. And it's sort of like a modern retelling of Narcissus, where Dorian, in an attempt to always perceive himself and his beauty and himself, he loses sight of the world around him. And again, as every time he sins, the picture changes. So after Sybil commits her suicide, he regards the picture, and to his horror, for the first time, he realizes that nothing really has changed but the expression. And that's very interesting. The expression on his face in the painting is changed, and it's turned into this kind of, he calls it a scornful smirk, like a, I don't know how to do it, but it says that there's cruelty in the face. And so it's a really interesting psychological analysis, because there are people I can think of where they think that people look at them and don't like them, or they think that their face looks wrong or something, or that they think their resting face is, really bitchy or unpleasant, and they feel like if anyone saw what they were really like, they'd be really disgusted. So there's this idea that people will think that they look unpleasant and unapproachable, and they think that other people see their souls. And there's even a passage in here where, Basil, it's 20 years later, Basil runs into Dorian on the street, and, Basil's like, Dorian, I've been worried about you. I hear all these awful rumors in London about your behavior and your standing and your actions and whatnot. And he kind of invites him in. I want to confront you. Like, is any of this true? And he says, well, obviously not. And then he says, what about that painting I gave you? I've always been thinking about it. And, he says, Dorian, I don't know what you're thinking, but I wish I could see your soul. And that's when Dorian says, well, tonight you shall see my soul. I'll show it to you. And so it's a really interesting analysis where Dorian feels that his basic face nature and his presentation is the only thing that matters, and his soul and his inner face, so to speak, is completely corrupt, and he's doing everything to hide that. And so of course he hides the painting away up in his attic, but Basil, he invites him up into the attic to see it, and 20 years on, the painting is completely disfigured. He doesn't even, when Basil sees it, doesn't even recognize it until he sees his signature at the bottom. And so, the man in the painting is old, disheveled, ugly, horrifying. And so Dorian, literally in the book, that's how he thinks it really is. But the metaphorical aspect is that this is his representation of his soul and his inner self. So when he sees his inner self, it's been completely tarnished and corrupted and destroyed, and he feels like he's leading a fake life where he's retained his youth, and his outward appearance is the only thing that matters. His material self is all that matters. And it's this obsession/possession with this frame of mind where he needs to hide his sin from the world, and he can never be healed because he always sees it. I'll just read you some of the book. You can see the text there. It's pretty decently sized. This was 200 pages, so it was still pretty easy to go through. He would examine with minute care and sometimes with a monstrous and terrible delight the hideous lines that seared the wrinkling forehead or crawled around the heavy sensual mouth, wondering sometimes which were the more horrible, the signs of sin or the sins of age. He would place his white hand against the coarse bloated hands of the picture and smile. He mocked the misshapen body and the failing limbs. That's a pretty straightforward description. It does get somewhat poetic in other places, but essentially in this attic where he's invited Basil Howard, Basil makes the comments that I can't believe that this thing has happened, that the painting is entombed with magic powers essentially, and there's something about Basil's pity that drives Dorian mad. And so Dorian in turn takes a knife and attacks and stabs Basil out of rage and kills him almost instantly. And the rest of the book is getting rid of the body, getting rid of the witnesses. At another point, he's assaulted by James Vane, Sybil Vane's brother, who, even 20 years later, still holds a grudge out against him. And he kind of attacks him in this opium den where Dorian has gone to drown his woes in drugs. So again, in order to escape the nature of his sin, he's drowning it in material things like drugs and alcohol and things like that. And even then, James Vane, when he tries to assault him, Dorian says, put your lamp up to my face. And he can see that he's 20 years haven't passed, and James never really got a good look at him, so he thinks, oh, I must have the wrong man because he looks so young. And then, James dies in a hunting accident, and so Dorian kind of gets off scot-free, and the final climax of the book is Dorian is looking at his painting and thinking how horrid it is, and despite the fact he's gotten away with all these murders or these accidents, his hands in the painting are now essentially covered with blood. And so finally what he does in the final act of rage or madness or defiance is he stabs the portrait. And the poetic ending here is that when he stabs the portrait, it reverts to its original look of when he was young and blonde and youthful, and then he collapses on the floor and he turns into the man in the painting and dies instantly. And when his servants find him, they don't recognize him until they examined his rings. And that's the end of the book. So it's a great little novel. It's a little bit slow to start, but that ending, the way it ends, is like a bang. It is so tight and well written, and it's really a joy to read. Getting started though is a bit slow and paced kind of slowly, but it's a really great book. And I think, I don't know, what would I call it? I would call it a balm of madness, which proceeds to calm nature, because you kind of need to see someone go through this Narcissian extremism in order for yourself to reflect and be like, well, thank goodness that's not me, and all that other kind of business. But Dorian it's essentially a character study. It's a very interesting character study on someone who is very naive and young and youthful and gets corrupted by ideas that the only thing valuable about himself is the thing that's slowly being corrupted. So there's undertones of, ageism, I guess, where you have a fear and a desire not to age, to lose what you have, and the only reason why you can be happy, even though he makes himself unhappy by focusing on the passage of time. And even when he can remain young forever and retain what he really wants, he's still not happy. So again, it's this kind of Faustian, it's the Irish Faustian contract to look good for forever, I guess. I mean, I just thought of that, but yeah, it's incredibly Faustian in its nature. It's essentially the same kind of story, really. And oh my God, when the guy who they cast for Henry Wotton in the movie was perfect. He looked like I saw him. I thought, that's Mephistopheles. I didn't think that's Henry. That's Mephistopheles. It's just the little curled mustache and the goatee. It's so, oh my goodness. Something else I really was surprised by the movie, the 47 one, is that 99% of the movie is in black and white, but when they showed the portrait, that is the one time they show color, and it was really cool. And I can't imagine being in the movie theater in 1947 and seeing a movie that is still black and white, but then it has this technical prowess, which is color. And I can't imagine the reaction to the people in the theater when suddenly it switches to color to show the portrait, and suddenly it's a completely different world. And it's funny, I was watching the movie, and I thought almost that, oh, there was like some glitch, that there was like maybe like a old edition, and then when we hit this point in the movie, it was like the remastered edition, and then it just but then it reverted to black and white, and I kind of blinked and thought, was I seeing things? I actually almost didn't process it. It just kind of happened for one frame or one scene, basically. And it had a real effect on me. And in terms of movie making magic or technicality, it was that's such a great artistic design choice. And of course, it was novel at the time to have color, but it'd be so interesting to see if someone did something like that elsewhere. So it was using technology in a very artistic way that I really appreciate. I really appreciate what they did and how they presented it. I think if it were to be done again today, what I think would be really cool was that the painting itself would be in color, but everything in the background even would be in black and white. I think that would be even cooler. But yeah. The movie itself was pretty good, pretty all right. Again, they changed some things around about, the nature of James Vance's character, the whole not voodoo, but Egyptian cat thing, make it kind of hokey. And of course, when you read this, you can't imagine what Dorian Gray looks like. So I really appreciate it that way because it really creates an image in your mind. Another thing I also just on the movie point that I think is a really cool idea they could have done is that, and I think actually Quentin Tarantino talks about this in the movie Pulp Fiction. They're all after this magic or this expensive artifact, and it's inside this briefcase, and they always open it and there's this golden light that emanates from this briefcase. And I think Samuel L. Jackson's character says, "Is that what I think it is?" And he's like, "Oh yeah," but they never show the thing in question. And so there's a moment in the movie where they reveal the portrait of Dorian Gray, but it's taken from the back of the canvas. And I thought, oh, they're not going to show it because it kind of sees the character's reactions, and then it cuts to the picture. But I thought it'd be really interesting to never actually show the portrait, or maybe only show the portrait initially, but never show how it's transformed so it manifests in the minds of the audience. I think that's a really interesting cinematic technique to intentionally not show the main aspect or the main visual thing of the movie in order for it to transform and mold and kind of gel in the minds of the audience, and everyone has their own depiction of how horrible Dorian Gray looks or what kind of monstrous thing they created. And I mean, to their benefit, they made it pretty grotesque in the movie, but I imagine something much worse, frankly. Much worse and much more nuanced, I guess. But all in all, it was a very interesting book, and again, it kind of shows how people can. What it really reminded me of is when you would think, like in school, you would hold people's opinions of you over the opinions of yourself, and you could be so worried and flustered and anxious about what other people thought of the image of your soul that you would feel the need to hide it and hide your true self. And even when you look inside yourself, the image and the reflection you have of yourself, if it is ugly, it will cause you pain and torment and anxiety and all that stuff. And so I guess it's just one example that, they don't get into it, but I think it'd be interesting to have not a reversal or anything, but even in Faust, for example, after all of the terrible things that the doctor goes through, he's ultimately saved by Gertrude, I think her name is, who essentially gives forgiveness to him, gives him love, and whisks him away with the angels out of the hands of the devil, even after the contract has been fulfilled. It's like, well, I gave you your time, and now it's time to go to hell. And so the pure love of Gertrude saves him. I think it's different in Faust. Goethe wrote a different version of the play or of the book, but that's the one I read, at least. So unfortunately, Dorian Gray just ends with tragedy. There is no salvation or no happy ending. But I think there's so much potential or interesting potential for, the solution or the kind of happy ending possibility to be there, where there is a certain point, even in the book, where Henry, even after murdering Basil, he's like, well, I have to be good now. I'm determined to be good. I need to be good because there's still hope in the world. And he decides to marry this woman. And that's the other thing too. They changed that in the book, where in the movie there was like this young girl with Gladys, and then she grows up, and then she still wants to, be with Dorian as a full-grown woman. But in the book, it was that there was this girl called Hattie or something, who he wanted to be betrothed to. And and that's the big thing, because he goes to this hunting trip and he says, I decided not to marry this girl because I had the fear that I really wouldn't love her. I couldn't give her all of myself. And so he has this whole resolution to be fully good and redeem himself. And it'd be really cool if, as he does that, it does say this in the book. He does, after that first good deed, he says he sees the eyes in the painting at least change. And so it'd be so interesting to see the painting restore itself as Dorian finds some kind of motivation within himself, and to restore the painting to some kind of magical, originality. Or he has one revelation moment where he turns his soul over entirely, and he has this this crossing over mentally, and it's reflected in the painting, and he turns into like an angel, or the guy inside the painting comes to life. I don't know, there's just a lot of really cool ideas that percolated after I finished reading this book, and the potential to be even more horrifying. Like what if the guy in the painting came out of the painting and he started haunting Dorian, and when Dorian went to go check the painting was the same, but the man in the painting was gone, and it's the scenery, and he starts going crazy. So the potential for this whole thing, this object, this inanimate object, to be a reflection of the person's soul, is such an interesting trope that I think it's been done in a lot of other things, but never in a sense that I felt is super impactful, or in any way that I was reminded of this book. And the one line that does stand out from this book that I recall is, you shall always be fond of me, Dorian, for I represent all the sins that you couldn't commit, or all the sins you wished to commit. So there's a bug. And I always thought, that was a quote I heard from this, years ago, and I thought that's so, so well done. And I thought it was that going into this, I thought the painting itself was talking to him. I thought that the reflection of Dorian in the painting had its own sentience, and it was whispering to him all the sins he should commit and all the bad things he could do. But really, it's his friend Henry who's doing that, and the portrait is just a visual representation. So I can't say I'm disappointed, because it was a fantastic book, but I was a little bit let down, because I thought, it would be so interesting if the painting spoke to him and the painting influenced him, and he says, you must become like me, Dorian, and become some cheesy, even some like comic book-esque thing where, the main character or the villain sees himself in the mirror in a reflection, and he starts talking to himself. And I like to think that was like the epitome of that trope from this book, but that's not the case at all. Regardless, though, I think I've talked a good amount, and I've given you guys an idea of this. I really recommend it. Really great book, also very short, 200 pages, so that's maybe a day or two. I think it took me 3 days. I did it in a few afternoons. Definitely kind of heavy content, but again, a kind of a cautionary tale against how you see your own reflection. And of course, in my personal opinion, with Stoicism and other kind of philosophies, you form the reflection you want to see in yourself. And if you want to begin to see a better reflection of yourself, you start doing good deeds, and don't let yourself be haunted by your past sin, and to come into sync with the elements of your psyche that ail you, essentially. But yeah, fantastic book. Recommend it. Really enjoyed it. And that's it. Anyway, guys, as always, keep reading.